Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We're doing something a little different today. In the traditional Jewish reading for not only last week but for today, the scheduled reading is not in the book of Leviticus, even though globally speaking we are in the book of Leviticus. But because of Passover, then we have 2 weeks, and Passover being on the weekend, on the Shabbat this week, then we have readings that are for Passover. So last week we had a reading in Exodus, today we have a reading in Deuteronomy. But I want to take this opportunity for us to dig a little deeper, take a little more time, and go a little slower in the book of Leviticus, because obviously this is such an unfamiliar territory for everyone that we can actually use a little more time to get into the details of it. So next week, the scheduled reading, I believe it goes back to chapters 9, 10, and 11. We already talked about chapter 11. And but today I wanted to, when I was thinking, okay, where should we go now? Because we could have gone to chapter 12 or 13 and 14, which go together. But I decided to give you an overview of why these things, not only why study these things, but why did the Lord give these commandments in this section of the Torah, of the Word of God, and what are the implications of it? So, if I teach in chapter 12 or 13 and 14, we will have to be making references to chapter 15. And so I decided, let's just go straight into chapter 15. So today we're going to be in Leviticus 15, by 15. So we're going to see, we're going to use chapter 15 to see the overall picture of the clean and unclean categories. We're going to see the practical side of this. And if you know chapter 15 at all, you know this is a little bit of a private conversation here. It's an adult chapter, so to speak. So we're going to be talking about sexual intercourse, genitals, discharges, menstruation, and all of this. So we're going to have an adult conversation here. All right. So Leviticus 15:1. The Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them." So this is to be addressed to the children of Israel. However, if you look quickly at the end of the chapter, at the last verse, actually verse 31, in verse 31 it says, "Thus you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them." Verse 32, actually, that we're gonna return back to this. But verse 32 it says, "This is the law for the one with a discharge and for the man who has a seminal emission." So I want us to look at this phrase, the very first phrase here. This is the law. This is the Torah. Now remember, when we studied chapters 6 and 7, we found that there are 5 applications of the word Torah that become technical terms for the priest. So in chapter 6 and 7, we have, this is the Torah of the burnt offering. This is the Torah of the sin offering. This is the Torah of the grain offering. So we have 5 of those. So 5 instances in which the word Torah is addressed specifically to the priest, and it becomes a technical term. These are technical instructions for the priest, because these sections, even though we talk about, the text talks about the burnt offering and the grain offering and the sin offering, all of these, in chapters 1 through 5, they are addressed to Israel. In chapters 6 and 7, the Lord talks about the same offerings, but he talks about specific functions that only the priest did. Handling of the blood, the fat, and the fire on the altar, and things like that, that the regular Israelite had absolutely no access to it. It did not concern them, concern the priest. So, however, we said, when we studied that there were actually 10 of these Torot. Torot is the plural of Torah. So there are 10 instructions in the book of Leviticus alone. I believe we have a few other, maybe, I think maybe 5 more or something like that in the book of Numbers. We'll get there when we get to Numbers. But at least we have 10 here in the book of Leviticus. And so this is one of them. So we have the 5 that have to do with the sacrifices, and then another 5 that are in other areas of the book of Leviticus. So this is one of them. So this is a Torah for the one with the discharge. Now, if you think about this, then I'm saying that these technical applications of the word Torah are for the priests. However, what did verse 1 say? Let's go back to verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, speak to the sons of Israel. So which is it? Are these instructions for Israel, or are these instructions for the priests? The answer is yes. They're both. Why? Because this concerns daily life and family life. So this is for every Israelite. But it is addressed to the priests because the priests are in charge of teaching the families, teaching the common folks that this chapter, the content of this chapter, because as we will see, the more we get into it, we will see how it has everything to do with coming into the temple, into the tabernacle, or bringing the sacrifice meat into your home. All right? Okay. So now let's get into the text itself. So verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body. Okay, first of all, look at the word when. We've traced this word before in the book of Leviticus. Remember, I told you there are 2 types of these particles. These are grammatically, these are particles. And so you can have, like in here, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see the word key. Right, key. So you have key, and then in other places you have im in the Hebrew. They can both mean if or when. What they do is they introduce, the key introduces a major case, and the im introduces a sub-case. So not 100% of the time, but most of the time, they speak of categories. So one is a big category, the key is a big category, and the im are the subcategories. They go under the key. And they're just cases. So this is the case when a man has this. So the case when that's how it goes. That's the thinking. And what that does is that it outlines the chapter for us. And when I studied linguistics, they told us, I studied linguistics in the context of deciphering unspoken languages. In other words, going into the Amazon, I'm sorry, not unspoken language, unwritten languages. If it is unspoken, it's not a language, right? Unwritten languages. So you go in the middle of the Amazon and you learn the language and you write the grammar. You figure it out and you write the grammar. So this takes years of you having no clue what's going on grammatically in this language. And you are progressing slowly. You may even speak it, but you don't know the rules, and you're trying to figure out the rules. And so they told us, in linguistics, 90% of your work is just organizing, just categorizing. You put it in different categories until you discover that there is a better category for it, and then you move. So you gain insight, and you understand it better, so You file it properly, so to speak. Well, that's a lot of what we need to do in the text of Scripture. Once we find the structure of it, then the content just unlocks. So there is meaning even in the structure. So that's why I gave you some of the structure so we can grasp the meaning. So here in this chapter, we're going to have 4 cases, so 4 major cases. And so we'll see, and they come in a structure that is called a chiastic structure. This comes from a Greek letter that it's basically an X. So when you have an X, you have point 1 and you have A and A sub A, and then you have B and sub B. So you have these categories that are related. A lot of scripture, specifically the Tanakh, is written, this is very artistic structure built in that conveys a lot of the meaning of the text. So what we have here is, we're talking about bodily discharge. If you just walked in, we're having an adult conversation here. We're going to talk about genitals, we're going to talk about semen, we're going to talk about all of these things. And so we have 4 cases here. One is normal, male, and abnormal. Well, actually begin with abnormal male emission, normal male emission, and then normal female emission is abnormal. So if you see, the abnormal is like a sandwich structure, and you have the 2 normal cases in the middle. It's done intentionally that way. All right, so let's get into these cases then. Verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body. Okay, the word body here is the word flesh. In the Hebrew, this is the word basar. It's the regular word for flesh. This is a euphemism. This is standing for the genitals. That's what we're talking about here. So when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Well, unfortunately, a better translation, what the Hebrew says here is, by his discharge, he is unclean. There's no point in knowing that the discharge itself is unclean. What's important is that the person is unclean. So, and that's what the text actually says. By his discharge, he is unclean. So he is unclean by his discharge. Verse 3. This, moreover, shall be his uncleanness in his discharge. It is his uncleanness whether his body allows its discharge to flow or whether his body obstructs its discharge. Okay, what are we talking about here? All right. It seems like what we're talking about here, okay, number one, this is an abnormal bodily male discharge. So what scholars agree is that we're talking about 2 types of gonorrhea here. And I went in and I researched it a little more, as much as you can research on Google. I didn't consult with my wife. My wife is the medical person in the family, but there are at least 2 types of gonorrhea. One that is caused by sexual activity, is transmitted sexually that we know, but there is one that actually has to do with the inflammation. Well, they both have to do with the inflammation of the urethra. Easy for you to say.
Urethra.
Not to be confused with
urethra. Yes. But one of them is called gonorrhea benigna. And so the gonorrhea benigna is the one that is not even transmitted sexually. It's an obstruction, it's an inflammation of that body part. Urethra. Thank you. That's why I brought bacon today to help me. So it can flow. So it's a pus that will come in the urine, and it could be mixed with the semen. And so we'll talk about the semen and why semen makes a person unclean in a moment. We're going to talk about it in a moment. But in this case, then, this is the abnormal. This is obviously a condition that this man has, or that a man can have, that is abnormal. Okay, here comes the important part. Verse 4. Every bed on which the person with the discharge lies becomes unclean, and everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Why do you need to know this? Well, verse 5 says, anyone, moreover, who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So if you touch his bed, you will become unclean. Verse 6, and whoever sits on the thing on which the man with the discharge has been sitting, then shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. All right, so why is this important? Well, this is important because if you're having Passover, you bring to your home a meat that is sacrificed. And the instruction in the early chapters of Leviticus is that you need to eat it, you need to be clean in order to eat it. You cannot be unclean. Mm-hmm. So you need to know, right? Okay, is daddy having an abnormal emission? Is daddy sick? Yes, he is. Okay, where did daddy sit? I can't sit there. I can't touch his bed. This is the reason why the book of Leviticus is the very first scripture that Jewish children were taught in the first century, in the time of Yeshua, in around that time, before and after. The book of Leviticus was taught, that was the first thing taught to a 5-year-old. Why? Because they need to know. Sweetie, did you go and touch daddy's bed? Yeah, I didn't mean to. That's okay. It's okay. We're just going to buy you McDonald's today, right? You can't eat from the sacrifice that we're bringing home today, and we'll save it for tomorrow. Tonight, we'll give you a bath. You're gonna wash your clothes. And then tonight, after sunset, then you can eat from the sacrifice. Oh yeah, I remember the rabbi was teaching about that. Exactly. So everyone in the family needed to know these things. And so these were conversations that they needed to happen early on.
Well, even the mothers got it too.
Exactly. So it was very much an open subject, because everyone needed to be fully aware of all of the categories of clean and unclean, all of the possibilities of how you become unclean, and what type of uncleanness, because there are levels of uncleanness. We know there are levels of holiness, right? You have the holy place and you have the Holy of Holies. And even around the altar, right, it says that the priests are supposed to eat this in a holy place. Well, there was a spot around the altar that carried a higher level of holiness. I'm talking about the altar of sacrifice. He's not in a holy place. We know inside the holy place, everything is holy. But even outside, there are levels of holiness there's a dynamic going on there. And so it's the same with uncleanness. There are levels of uncleanness. Notice that we're in Leviticus 15, verse 5 again. It says, anyone who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Until evening. This is the lowest form of uncleanness. It's a one-day uncleanness. and then it was salt. And also important is that this level of uncleanness, this lowest level of uncleanness, this 1 day uncleanness, you could not pass it on to another person. Now watch this. The man with the unclean discharge, he passes it on to other people because that's not a basic uncleanness. That's a little higher level of uncleanness. So he was contagious, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Wherever he sat, wherever he lay, that actually even become contagious too. But if you touch his bed, then you were unclean, but you were not contagious. See, because the level of uncleanness is reduced as it is passed down. So does that mean that, now, let me tell you this. I read a quote from Ramban. Some of you are familiar with Ramban. Ramban was a middle-aged, huge rabbi, extremely important rabbi, one of the most important rabbis in all of Judaism, all times. And he writes that the implication is that even in biblical times, women who were menstruating were kept in a different house. They couldn't talk. Even their breath communicated uncleanness. Even their breath. That's what Rambam teaches. Now, here's the thing. I'm reading this in a scholar. Thanks. I'm reading this in a scholar named Jacob Milgrom. Jacob Milgrom, he passed away a few years ago. Jacob Milgrom was a conservative rabbi, but he was also a scholar. Now he happens to be, if you ever have a chance, Google Jacob Milgrom. Milgrom. M-I-L. Jacob Milgrom is considered the top Leviticus authority ever. And so Jacob Milgrom quotes Rambam, this quote, and he says, actually, Rambam is quoting another Middle Age source, which differs from the Talmud. In other words, the Talmud is actually more lenient than Rambam was. So what Rambam was quoting was definitely not biblical practice, was definitely not even first century practice. It was Middle Age practice. That is extremely important because Messianics today, they go to sources and they pick up sources and they take on practices that are not biblical.
Amen.
And the tendency, remember the tendency of what we've studied about the components of Judaism is that it becomes stronger and stronger, more invasive in areas that the Torah never meant to go to.
Legalism.
This is extremely oppressive.
Yeah.
Extremely oppressive.
Very impressive.
And so we'll make some more comments about this. Part of the problem then is that people take the legalistic interpretation that some have had and they attach it to the Torah. So you hear people preaching, for instance, on the woman that had the issue of blood for 18 years and came to Yeshua, touched the tzitzit, and got healed, right? Very, very popular passage in Messianic circles because it talks about the tzitzit, and appropriately so. But some expound about this, and they go on to say, well, women, they couldn't touch anybody, they couldn't speak to anybody, so they take these quotes from people like Rambam, and they attach it to first century practice, and that is anachronistic. It will be almost for you to say, well, George Washington got on his computer and he Googled, King James and George. Yes. No. Rambam lived around the year 1200. That's 1,000 years separated from Yeshua. So if you think it's silly to put a computer and the internet in the hands of George Washington, who lived just 200 some years ago. Imagine doing that 1,000 years. Totally anachronistic. That's not what you do. But people do that.
Well, doesn't that come back to the issue though, that the women that were having their monthly, they were not allowed in the temple, not even to be near the temple area, and they were not to be around anyone either. They were to stay secluded
No,
until that
hang on.
cycle.
You started right, but then the second part of your statement was reflective of
Of what they were
yes,
saying, okay.
yes.
Okay.
So we'll touch on this in a moment. All right. So you needed to know the types of uncleanness, the levels of uncleanness, and the levels of how were they contagious, right? So you really everyone needed to. This was not supposed to be technical knowledge. Let me put it that way. This was supposed to be common knowledge. I'm going to make a pause here because obviously we're not going to cover the whole thing. We already have 15 minutes to the end of this, and then some 10 minutes that we might steal. We always do. By the way, if you came in late, I made an announcement. We're going to start now the study at 11 o'clock, not at 11:15, so that we can have a little extra 15 minutes.
Okay.
All right. I want to address some implications of this for us today before we continue in the text. I have a few questions. Is living this way oppressive?
No.
Which way?
This way that we're describing?
Wrong or the way it's?
No.
This
The
way?
biblical
No.
way.
No.
Yeah.
No.
No, because I think it's back to Matthew when the Lord tells the people to come and, and learn of him, take his yoke upon them, for his yoke
All right.
is easy and his burden is light.
We're going to keep the comments a little short
Yeah.
because we're running out of time. Is this really from God?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, you're reading it in the scriptures, so it has to be from God. These are the implications of God dwelling among people. So he could have just not even bothered, and say, okay, you people, I don't want you to suffer the consequences of you defiling my tabernacle. So let's just not even get into this mess, right? I won't live with you. Now, God said that to Moses,
Yeah.
and Moses would have none of it.
Yeah.
He said, if you don't go with us, I'm not going anywhere. You have to come with us. Because it was the same thing. The Lord said, listen, I'm living among you. I'm going to end up killing y'all. That's just what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And Moses, I think the Lord was just playing a little bit with Moses, kind of testing him. How bad do you want my presence?
Yes.
Ask me for it, I'll give it to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the Lord said, okay, I'll live with you, but you got to build me a tabernacle, put a lot of things, in between me and you, and you got to do all of these things, not so that you can live this legalistic life, or so that you can, prove to me that you really are obedient to me. But listen, I want you to. Okay, let me share this with you. This is personal, and this is going to tie in to why I teach this, and for you to understand who I am. Let me tell you a couple of things. Number one, I have a nickname that I haven't told you. At least I haven't said it for a while. And I've been studying the book of Leviticus. I discovered this I discovered Jacob Milgram. I believe it was 2001. It was right around 9/11. That's why I remember. So I've been studying the book of Leviticus for 18 years, in depth, by the hand of the man who is the world's authority on Leviticus, Jacob Milgram. And so my daughter gave me a nickname. And she called me the Leviticus nerd. That is why, in every opportunity I have, I bring in Leviticus. You've noticed this. But The reason why we take the time to look at this is, I have a couple of reasons. Number one, even if you feel like this is totally unrelated, totally irrelevant, number one, this is your Bible.
Amen.
You need to know your Bible. I'm not teaching you Judaism. I'm not teaching you the doctrines of man. This is your Bible.
Amen.
You need to know your Bible for you to teach it accurately.
That's right.
So you don't go and teach about the woman with the issue of blood for 18 years, and then you say all kinds of things that you read in a commentary that was written by a man who had not taken the time to study these things. Yeah, they study some things, but not this. So they quote some sources, but they don't know where it came from, just like I demonstrated. You need to know your Bible. And even more importantly, you really need to know your God.
Amen.
You really do. If you think that Yeshua is different, that he changed things, let me tell you this. The one who spoke to Moses in the burning bush was the angel of the Lord. That is Yeshua.
Amen.
That's the same one who gave the Torah to Moses. The one who gave the Torah to Moses and to Israel was Yeshua.
Amen.
So if you think Yeshua changed things, you need to get acquainted with him a little more intimately. Yes.
Well, if we only think what an awesome, loving, faithful Father we have, and He shows us all these things, how to live with one another, how, because He foreknew what was going to take place. So He's showing us ways how to make a better living for each one of us. And so all His commandments and His counsel in here, how to live with one another, is for our own good. Because like this, look what is happening today. It's an absolute mess because people are just dirty.
Right.
And He told us how to be clean.
It's true. You said it right now.
Amen. It's true. It's true.
It's true.
All right. Verse 8. Let's touch on a few of these things with the time that we have. It says, or if the man with the discharge spits on one who is clean, he too shall wash his clothes in bathing water and be unclean until evening. So even the spit communicates uncleanness.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to know that, right? Verse 9. Every saddle on which the person with the discharge rides becomes unclean, and then everything else, all the implications apply. Whoever touches it, all of this applies. Verse 11. Likewise, whomever the one with the discharge touches without having rinsed his hands in water shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. This is probably where the washing of the hands practice actually comes from. Because the person with the discharge can touch someone. If he washed his hands, then the person does not become unclean. But if he has not washed his hands, then the person does become unclean. Now, what if somebody touches you? They didn't wash their hands. You didn't know. You are unclean and you don't know it. You see, there's a lot of implications here, right? So, you're going to, if you bring a sacrifice that day, and if you discover later that you ate some of the sacrifice and you were unclean and you didn't know it, then you go to Leviticus 5. That's the chapter for you. And then so this is the guilt offering. You discover later on that, it wasn't a sin of commission. It wasn't that you went out of your way to do something, but it was unknown to you. Verse 12, however, an earthenware vessel which the person with the discharge touches shall be broken, and every wooden vessel shall be rinsed in water. So if he touches something made out of wood, then you can wash it and it becomes clean. But if it is made out of clay or things like that, then you have to destroy it. It cannot come back to a clean state. So all of these categories, you needed to know this just to live around the house. All right, verse 13. Now, when the man with the discharge becomes cleansed from his discharge, then he shall count off for himself 7 days for his cleansing. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water and will become clean. So when the emission stops, it can last however long it lasts. When it stops, then he starts counting 7 days. And then after that, he will be clean. Notice the phrase here, running water. The word is living water. So living water in Scripture is actually running water. So you needed to find a source, either a spring, a river. It couldn't just be a pond. A lake is okay, Lake Galilee is okay because it's actually running water. It comes from the mountains. It accumulates, but it keeps running into the Jordan River. So the ocean is running water. So it's living water. Then he brings a sin offering. He brings 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And he says one is for a sin offering and one is for a burnt offering. And they're to make atonement. Why? Did he sin? By getting sick? No. So why a sin offering? Well, here's the thing. A sin offering, I think we talked about this. I think I need to go back and clarify some of these things, because I don't think I've taught it sufficiently. Okay, a sin offering is better translated by its function. What does it do? Instead of just giving it a name associated with sin. This is the offering that you bring when there's an association with sin. Well, that's kind of a generic, and it doesn't fit all context. Because, for instance, the woman that gives birth, she brings a sin offering. Did she sin? No. Right? So, it's actually better defined by the function. So what does a sin offering do? A chata offering. That's the Hebrew word. What does it do? Well, it purifies. It purifies. It makes things clean. It purifies. So this is better known as a purification offering. So it's better translated as the function that it does. So this is a purification offering. And so the purification offering makes atonement. Why? Because it brings the blood. Yeah, atonement is to bring the blood and infuse life. So you bring the turtle dove and it infuses the altar with life. Why? Why? Well, uncleanness ultimately has a source in death. In the case of this man, his discharge becomes it's a combination of urine, pus from his illness, and semen. And so the loss of semen, or the loss of the eggs in a woman's menstruation, they are a loss of life. You see, not every type of bleeding causes uncleanness. In fact, only one type of bleeding in a woman causes uncleanness, which is the menstrual bleeding. Why? It's not because of the blood. It's because the blood is mixed with the eggs, and so there is a loss of life. Therefore, there is death. So the association of uncleanness is with death. Then that puts it in the right perspective for us, because now we understand that holiness is all about life, uncleanness is all about death. So now we see why these two things clash. So when the man becomes ill, he has the discharge, he is unclean. The presence of God living in the temple, in the tabernacle, is so sensitive. The life is so sensitive that it's almost like wirelessly, like a Wi-Fi, it knows. It knows that there's some type of uncleanness. It is sensitive to it. And so it makes the altar, this sensitivity of the altar, it needs to be infused with life on your behalf. If you let it go, then you incur guilt. And eventually, you will have to suffer consequences for this. Because for you to just let it go, to not care, it's saying something to God. It's saying something about the covenant in which you are with Him. And so, therefore, they need to bring the blood because of the life that is in the blood, infuses on the altar on your behalf. And so then you don't incur guilt. There was no sin involved, just the issue of uncleanness, which is, it brings death into the picture. Well, we're running out of time, but verse 16, then it talks about a normal male emission, which implies involuntary seminal emission, which happens mostly of unmarried men, or just plain sexual intercourse. So again, because of the loss of life, even when there is conception, we know from science, obviously, that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of potential life, of sperm actually dying eventually. So because of the loss of life, then it transmits uncleanness. And so, we read in verse 17, as for any garment or any leather on which there is seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. If a man lies with a woman so that there is seminal emission, they shall both bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Let me show you a passage in 1 Samuel. This a little bigger. You know the story? David and Bathsheba. What's that? Bathsheba, yes. Okay, so he sees her. Let me see. I'm actually in 1 Samuel, should be 2 Samuel.
Second Samuel 11.
So he sees her, calls for her, she comes. We know what happens. So verse 4, 2 Samuel 11:4, it says, David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her, and when she had, watch this, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. I bet you never even paid attention to that. She went in, she had intercourse, and then she bathed because she was unclean. Now, the hypocrisy of it is unbelievable. Oh, I'm unclean. Yeah, you are. Okay, we'll leave it there. Actually, so just so you know, when it says, and she returned to her house, the word for return is the same word for repentance. How rich is this passage? I mean, wow, right?
I wonder why David never mentioned her. No, I always wonder when Nathan spoke to David, all through David's repentance, he never mentioned Bathsheba. He never said it was her fault or anything. That's good. That's good.
All right, so we're out of time. The next portion of it, the next two portions, then they speak of it's going to then speak of the woman. It's going to speak of then of the normal emission, which is menstruation, and then the abnormal female emission, which is the case that we see in the Gospels of the woman with the issue of blood for 18 years. So the instruction is, okay, the day when you're healed, then you wait 7 days, and you bathe, you bring 2 pigeons or turtle doves, one for sin offering, one for burnt offering. So it's the same that we saw with the man. So the man with the abnormal emission and the woman with the abnormal emission, their levels of uncleanness are the same. They last until the issue stops, and the prescription for the sacrifices are the same. The days of their uncleanness are the same. And then for the menstruating woman, then she's unclean for the 7 days. Now in Orthodox Judaism, then they do 2 things. Number one, there's no sexual intercourse during the menstruation, which is biblical. I had a couple of passages later on in Leviticus for you, but I lost them, so I don't have them. But it is specifically forbidden to have sexual intercourse during menstruation. But in Orthodox Judaism, then it is extended for 7 days, even after the first 7 days. And now this is oppressive. This is an extension of really the intention of the biblical commandments. Is this for Gentiles? Is this for believers in Yeshua?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't be so quickly, because the reason is this: it's a little more complicated than that. And I'm not going to leave you hanging for an entire week. We can talk about this next week. But I'll just say this: it is on a voluntary basis, because this deals with physical holiness, physical uncleanness. Spiritually speaking, when you believe in Yeshua, you are cleansed.
Amen.
Once and
And
for
for
all.
all.
So then, physically speaking, some people are Jews and some are not. So this has to do. A Gentile believer is under the new covenant. A Jewish believer is under the new covenant and the Mosaic covenant. The Gentile non-believer is definitely not under either one. It's not under the Mosaic covenant. And the Gentile believer also is not under the Mosaic covenant. However, if the Gentile believer wants to live in community with Jewish believers the way it was meant to be, then it will be good of him, of her, to consider taking on these practices, not because he has to,
Because he wants.
but because he voluntarily chooses. It's the case of Ruth. Was she obligated to? No. But once she said, "Your God will be my God," and she went and married this guy, he said to her, "Listen, honey, we can't have intercourse during your menstruation." I've never heard of such a thing. Is it for me? Yeah, you're married to a Jew.
Yeah.
So this is what we're going to do in our home. Another reason why to take on these practices is because that's your future.
Exactly.
You see, in the future, in the world to come, everybody's going to be sanctified physically as well as spiritually.
Amen.
Same in the millennium. So we are walking towards the reality.
Yes.
So God sanctified the Jew to show the Gentile that he wants to sanctify them also.
Amen.
And to show them what it means to live a sanctified life. Because God wants to sanctify everyone.
Everyone.
So
Come on.
another reason why look at this and consider living this way is because that's your future. That's just your future as a believer. So, all right, we're totally out of time. So.